William Paterson, the pioneer child from Edinburgh who became a country storekeeper in Otago and found a second career running the Early Settlers Museum.
William Paterson was born here in Edinburgh in 1854 at 36 Buccleuch Street, where his father had a bakery, the family presumably living up above the shop. Now the Patersons were related to two other families who had already immigrated to Otago, but it was the recruiting mission of James Adam in 1857 that prompted them to follow their relations to the colony.
William's father attended one of Adam's talks in Edinburgh and was impressed by what he heard. It confirmed his cousin's positive news about the Otago settlement and clinched his decision to move his family to New Zealand.
They got berths aboard the Jura, one of 12 immigrant ships Adam dispatched to Otago in 1858. This portrait of William and his sister Mary was painted just before the family left Scotland. Now William was just 4 years old and he retained no memory of his early life in Edinburgh. But in old age, he could recall one memory of the ship being towed down the Clyde from Glasgow, past Greenock and into the open sea.
After a 4-month journey by sea, the Patersons arrived in Port Chalmers ready for a new life in the colony. Invariably, this involved some readjustment, and William's father James, like many new arrivals, began his colonial career as a labourer and worked briefly in a roading gang in Dunedin, making the road to Caversham.
It wasn't long before he was able to set up in business in his old trade as a baker here on the corner of Princes and Carroll Street, which was then called Walker Street. Now this was a great location, just up off the main South Road. He did good business with all the farmers who came in from the Tyree and Green Island and traded their eggs and butter for their bakery needs.
But James Paterson hadn't come so far just to replicate his Edinburgh life, and in 1864 he decided to try his hand at farming, purchasing land at Port Molyneux in South Otago. The family made the long journey south by dray. Like many settlers who dreamed of life on the land, James Paterson turned out to be ill-suited to farming. In 1867, he purchased the general store at Port Molyneux instead and returned to the more familiar role of merchant. The small coastal settlement was a busy place in those days, the port through which produce from the farms for 50 kilometres around was shipped out, and their supply needs shipped in.
There were numerous shops, 2 hotels and a combined church and school where William and his siblings received their education. There were also all sorts of tradesmen in business, a policeman, a customs official, a bonded store, and right down at the mouth of the river, a signal station. Hard to imagine now when Port Molyneux is just a name on the map, but back then it was a place of substance, and the Patersons would operate their store here through 2 generations until 1936.
When he was old enough, William joined his father in the business and spent some time working at Brown Ewing's store in Dunedin to master the drapery trade.
He was called home in 1875 when his father bought a second store here at Puerua, and 21-year-old William was put in charge. He was to spend the next 40 years here in what he described as the best years of my life, delighting in the many-faceted tasks of running a country store and the rich communal life that flowed through its doors. William married Isabella Begg in 1881, and the couple had 4 children in a marriage that lasted for over 60 years. William was a devout Presbyterian, also an enthusiast for the temperance cause. In fact, led the charge for prohibition in the Clutha district. In 1894, in fact, the Clutha electorate was the very first in the country to vote for no licence, banning all liquor selling outlets from the county, including the hotel directly across the road from William's store, which had so long irked him by its very presence. By 1913, trade in these small country settlements began to decline with increasing numbers of cars and the drift of custom to the larger towns. There's even less to be seen now in Puerua than at Port Molyneux. William retired from the store and moved to Dunedin, but his working life was far from done. 2 years later, he was appointed Secretary of the Otago Early Settlers Association and began a second hobby career as director of its museum, now known as Toitū, but then the Early Settlers Museum. He was a fabulous choice for the role. With the public relations skills he had developed as a country storekeeper and his fabulous memory for names and faces, he became a mine of information on Otago's early history. Despite his advanced years, he was a very active custodian of the institution. For 27 years, he busily organised all its activities. And even into his 80s, he climbed up on ladders to move around the portraits to make room for new additions to the collection and hang them on the walls in this gallery. In fact, as a genuine early settler himself, William Paterson was for many years the museum's most interesting relic. He died in his 90th year, only relinquishing his museum duties during his final short illness. So it seems only right and proper that his portrait should also hang in this gallery, looking down over the scene of his labours and taking his place among the pantheon of early settlers whose memory he worked so hard to preserve.